I've just got the recording reminder on, so that's fine. Got it. So I just need to upload my PowerPoint presentation. Could I do that now? Yeah.
You should be able to do that.
Right, let's see. Technology is great, isn't it, when it works? Let's see if this works. So, thank you, first of all, everybody. My PhD, as I am, my parents are from Pakistan originally, and I am a second-generation Pakistani migrant. And one of the key drivers for me to do research in this area was because my father actually passed away about I'm giving my age away here, about 20 or so years ago, and I really wanted to know what it was like for the first generation Pakistani migrants who came to the UK in the 60s and 70s. And the more I looked around, I couldn't find anything. I just didn't know. There was no literature. And when I was listening to stories of my aunties and uncles in the community, it really fascinated me in how they actually sort of lived. There was men who came to the UK, and there would be about 10 or 12 men living in one house, and they would do day and night shifts, and they would share beds, and they were cooking big pots, and it was really tough times for them, and working long hours and walking to work in the snow. And apparently the snow in those days was very, very high, and it used to be really, really cold. So that really inspired me to do this. So what I'd like to do is just I'd like to share just a little bit about the theory behind it, because what I did was I used the theory developed by John Urey in 2007, and that's the mobilities paradigm, and that really refers to a mobility systems. And the reason why I used this theory as part of my PhD was because it looked at different mobility systems, whether that was, how movement takes place. So there's different kinds of movement, like who takes it and what movement there is. So that could be pavements and paths where people walk, public trains, cars and roads, as well as aero mobility. And bearing in mind that these first generation Pakistani migrants have now been in the UK for about 30-40 years, they're now aging migrants. So what I sort of observed at the time was that, the mobility wasn't as good as it was. So based on this mobilities theory, there is 5 main interdependent mobilities. I won't go into all of them, but I just will mention the names. There's corporeal, there's physical, there's imaginative, there's virtual, and there's communicative modalities. And the findings of my research are linked to the first one, which is corporeal travel. And basically what this is where people travel for work or for leisure, and looking at their family life, migration and escape as well. So it's organized across time and space. So I was able to look at the mobilities of this participant group at a local level, a national and an international level. So I've talked quite a bit, so I'm just moving on. Yeah. What I did, it was a qualitative research design with 28 participants, and at the time of doing the research, it was really helpful for each of the participants who I interviewed to identify another colleague or another community member who would welcome the chat. And what I found was a lot of these participants were really keen and interested to share their stories, because first of all, which is part of the findings, there was a lot of loneliness and isolation, and this was despite whether they were living with a large extended family or living on their own. So we'll just go on to some of the findings. There was several themes in terms of health, historical perceptions and moving forward. But what I'm going to do is just share some of the key areas and where the mobilities took place at a local area. So these older men and women from the Pakistani community would sort of walk mainly rather than drive or use other means of transport to carry out their daily chores. And this was their social aspect. So it meant a lot for them to be face to face. So the men would go out to congregational prayers. So the majority of the people I interviewed were Muslims from Pakistan, and the men, they had, some of them had retired. They'd had long sort of list of work sort of practices, and after discussing that, they said that they've now come to a point where they don't really meet a lot of people, and they found that when they went to these congregational prayers in mosques, that's where they would meet colleagues and friends rather than go to their houses. And what I'll do is I'll discuss the female aspects as well, as I talked about some of the themes, the narratives here. So it was really fascinating because working from a health and social care background, there was a lot of there's this perception amongst the health and social care commissioners where I've been working that, you know, this Pakistani community look after their own as the people get older. And I found that there was a lot of social isolation and loneliness, as I've mentioned earlier. But there was a lot of efforts also to try to combat that by these participants. So these particular narratives here, we had, there was 2 participants, and they were both friends who would, during the process of this PhD, managed to get a social prescription to go to the gym, and they were really, really excited about it. They went to get their gym clothes. They knew that they couldn't wear the traditional outfit because they said it was a health and safety risk, which is what the gym had advised. So you know, they were really excited about going to do this practice in terms of physical activity. So they would go on a Tuesday and a Friday. They would walk to the gym and walk back. In the hope that it would help their pain, but more importantly, just so that the friends could walk together, and then they would go to local shops on the way back. So that was their social practice at that time. And the key thing there was that they were able to walk. The next one was where there was a lot of funding around at the time of doing the PhD, and the women would have organized trips by specific communities, organizations, and what was lacking was that the funding was being reduced, or it was non-existent by the time I had finished my PhD. And I had several participants who used to go to the groups and said, you know, we used to go in lots of places around the country, and they really enjoyed that. That was, you know, how can I say, they said they had some spectacular sort of trips, and that really enhanced their lives. And they met people from, you know, on the trip, and they would take food and they would go to new places. So here in this second narrative, it's got, you know, they went to Bradford, they went to Scotland. You know, these are places they probably would not have gone to had this community organization not organized the trips. Moving on, there was some ill health of the participants, and although I listened and you know, I took, you know, they took part in the interview, give consent, I felt as sometimes they saw me as somebody who would perhaps take on board their issues and give them some direction or help them, but actually had to go back and explain that, you know, I was there as part of the interview and doing the research. So they would go into a lot of detail, as it can be seen from these two narratives here. There was some ill health amongst the participants. So the first narrative, the participant E, she was she really liked using her bus pass, and I think that was a novelty for her. She said, you know, she didn't have to pay, and that meant quite a lot. So they actually used the buses. So not only did they walk, but they used the public transport as well. But because of her ill health and her diabetes, she used to be worried about going, so that prevented her sometimes from going. Sadly, from the community, this participant has passed away now, because as a member of the community. With the second narrative, again, it was when this participant, she was pregnant in her early days when she first came here, and she said she didn't know much, and there was one woman, another lady who was educated, not a lot, but knew enough to take her to the hospital. But she said she refused to get examined, and there was no translation or interpretation facilities at the time. But in her mind, she felt as if she could, you know, she did well because she didn't get the examination. So there's education aspects here. I don't know what else to add to that, apart from the fact that, you know, by reading through that, you can probably get an idea of the mindset of this participant. She said she was very, very scared. She didn't know what was happening because she was in a new country. She didn't have people around her who understood her, and in her home she was alone as well. But I think some of these issues, as you know, in terms of male doctors, there is literature on this, and majority have been addressed. In moving on now, in terms of the male narratives, this was a really interesting participant, because despite this participant having 5 children and living in an extended family, he had lost his wife. I think it was a couple of years before the interviews, and he said that he was very, very lonely, to the point where I had to switch the recorder off, and at that time it was I had my digital recorder because actually, wait a minute, sorry, yeah, it is this one. There's 2 narratives, yeah, and because both of the male participants who I have here were quite lonely, but one of the participants, and it was this one, who actually got very, very upset, and I had to switch the recorder off and didn't continue the interview afterwards. But as you can see from this narrative, that they were very instrumental in developing the community facilities, the halal meat, etc. You know, and worked, you know, in their own words, worked really hard, worked for £7 to £10 wages, and was promoted in the ranks of, for example, the bus driver, etc., to in their role, and felt really proud of it, because they were always on time, and always wanted to had this attitude of can do. So this is the participant. Sorry, I got confused there. This is the participant who was the widow and was very, very lonely, and I had to switch the tape off. The 74-year-old, and he's still living in the community, and he visits his daughter every now and again. But despite living in an extended family, he has no sort of social activities to attend. He says he doesn't know where he really goes, and he just feels like a lost part. He sometimes walks around the shopping centres, indoor shopping centres, just to kill time. The third narrative here, participant K, again, another male participant, and it was more about their work life, and that's where their social work sort of revolved around. So they developed, despite having some setbacks, kept going, and now actually has a very successful travel agency. So I hope that's given you a little bit of an idea of some of the social practices under corporeal travel for the older Pakistani male and female participants within this PhD. Over to you. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take as many as needed, and hopefully I'm within time as well.
Dr. Akhtar, over to you. Would like to start the discussion?
Oh, yeah. Okay. Thank you, Sonia, and thank you, Zeb, for a really really interesting exploration of some of the themes which emerged from your PhD. And once this paper is written, I really look forward to reading it. There's some really interesting material there. I guess what I'd like to probe a little bit, or just get some of your thoughts on. You've presented some really interesting narratives around aging amongst British Pakistanis in one particular location. And I wondered, from your research, whether you could say that you could generalize from your case study within this one location and say, well, are those themes current across other Pakistani communities across the UK, and then possibly even other Pakistani communities, migrant communities across Europe, for example? And maybe flipping it the other side and saying, well, actually, if we look at some of the themes which come up, loneliness, isolation, how specific are they to the migrant experience, or how specific are they just to that generation as a whole? You know, I think we have there's lots and lots of policy talk in the UK around issues of loneliness, which really came to the fore during the pandemic, actually. And I'm not sure if it's limited to either the Pakistani experience or the migrant experience. I think it's pretty much it can possibly be a universal experience, especially in aging as people become isolated. And maybe just hear a little bit more about some of the themes which you think emerged. So some really interesting interview material in terms of how you can bring it together when you're telling the story of your participants. What are the big themes which you think are emerging? We get a sense of some real details, some really interesting nitty-gritty. But what is the takeaway? If I was going to if I was going to take one thing away from your presentation, from your PhD, what would it be?
Thank you very much, Dr. Akhtar. I will try to do my best, but please just add in if I digress, because there's so much, and as you can imagine, that I've got so much data, and I've really tried to narrow this down for this presentation. But first of all, absolutely, I am continuing on my research in aging across different communities universally, and yes, social isolation and loneliness is a key factor across these communities. It is, so it's not just within the Pakistani migrant community, but actually this within the migrant community in the South Asian, what I'll sort of define it as, which includes the Indian, Pakistani and Bangladeshi, especially those who came to the UK or sort of like migrated from their home countries in the 60s and 70s, are now aging. And what we're finding is that the second generation migrants, the second generation, for example, myself and my children who are third generation, you know, we need to move away for work, or, you know, we're not at home all the time, which is where originally the first generation migrants were, from the data that I have, the women tended to stay at home and looked after the family, and the men went to work. Hence why we've got the narratives that a lot of the men are at work, but the women have, the children have now left home, or, you know, they have their own lives, and then they're trying to fill their daily lives with other activities to reduce the social isolation and loneliness. So it is, I feel as if it is across the board, across, you know, the European countries as well, where it would be really interesting to carry some research out to see if it's any different, because from the literature that I've read and the research, that, which is not a lot, I must add, there still needs to be a lot of work to be done, a lot of research to be done, because we're looking at other aspects, but it's broadening it to health inequalities. And what we found, the takeaway for you today is perhaps is that these participants were quite innovative in their practices. So they've tried to look at different ways in order to live their lives. For example, going to the gym. Whereas they said originally that was what their children did, but they were laughing. They thought it was really funny. They didn't know why they were going to the gym, but they were going to the gym because it was not heard of as, you know, as a grandma, they were going to the gym. So there was all this, you know, these barriers that were crossing, which was really, it was really inspiring for me to listen to them, because there was this within them, but it was moving away from their community, their cultural norms. So, and the last thing I'll just add to that is, because I didn't actually talk about the aero mobility, and that is where, you know, they used to, when they were a lot more mobile, were able to travel back home quite often. But now, because of the mobility issues, for example, the ill health, they weren't even able to walk, let alone travel to the home countries. And some of the interviews had they said that they were, you know, it was really sad that they knew that they couldn't see these families, the extended families in their home countries face to face. But they've now got the digital technologies, and they have their children or their grandchildren showing them how to use the phones, and they can talk to the phones even on a daily basis. And they felt, even though that they didn't get that rush of energy when they were face to face, but by talking to them, it sort of compensated and alleviated that, you know, tension that they weren't meeting their families. So I think the first generation Pakistani migrants that I've interviewed were really inspiring and wanted to try new practices, whether they were social and also in terms of digital technologies. They wanted to use the phones, and they were excited about all these new aspects. So how can I say this? I think there's a lot more work to be done and a lot more education from that aspect, but and it's across, and I would say this is perhaps general across the UK as well, and other countries. So I wouldn't say it's just specific to the Pakistani migrants, but universal. I'm hoping I've answered your question, Dr. Akhtar. I hope that's given something, but please do add if I need to add any more.
No. Great. Can I just come in again? Is that okay? If I come in again? I see somebody's I see hands up, so I don't. But if I could just come back and say, you know, again, like from your descriptions and from your answer, it's really interesting. You've got this, you know, huge data sets and wonderful, intricate material there. Possibly, could we then, if we're going to extrapolate from that material, could we then say that this is something which is probably the working class experience, or the migrant experience more broadly? So the working class experience in the UK, the migrant experience, you know, would it be similar to, can we say, to the Turks or Moroccans or the Algerians in France or Denmark or Germany? You know, or how culturally specific is it? Because one thing I wanted to pick up on, one thing which I think you mentioned briefly, and I think is really interesting, is this, it's the community specific angle. So you mentioned that, amongst policymakers, there was this idea that this community, they look after their own. I think that was what you that was the phrasing. And I want to know then, that's really interesting. That, I think, is something which is culturally specific. That's something specific to this group, which we couldn't possibly, I think, maybe extrapolate in different ways to other either social groups or migrant communities. So this idea, what is it about the Pakistani community or the Pakistani diaspora, either in this one locality, in the UK more broadly, in Europe, or globally, actually, that makes this looking after your own something which is specific to them? It could we possibly think about kinship networks? I'm thinking about, some of the family networks, the wider kin networks, the community support. Is that something that you saw in your research, that the importance of kinship in looking after your own, the phrasing that you used?
I think it's really interesting, because we're now into the third generation in this community group, and it feels like, although the first generation want to hold on to this, looking after their own, with the second generation, the third generation, it's sort of diluting. And from a community aspect, I think there's a real tension. So I don't know if I could say that in how it's mentioned, because we're pulled in all directions, if that makes sense. There's work, there's childcare, you've got your families, and it almost feels as if, and this actually did come out of the data as well, as I think there was one participant, and what she said was they came to the UK to earn money and to have a better life for themselves and for their family and their children. But what's happened is that, say, for example, this particular participant, she's had her, there was her son had married an English woman, and then they got a divorce, and now he's living elsewhere. So she felt as if the culture had gone, and she'd lost her son, and she goes, was it really all worth it? So there was this like really tug, like she said the cost of what they've actually now experienced was it really worth it? Should they have stayed at home? So there was a real tension, if that makes sense, and it's really more about acceptance and moving on. So there was, and I don't know how to, but then equally there was other participants who had said that they'd got some training and education, and one of them was the head of a refuge centre, and she developed quite a lot as a woman, and her husband was very proud of her, and her family was very, very proud of her as a Pakistani woman holding a role in such a position. So the community at first, they used to talk and say, why are your women working? They shouldn't be working, you should be looking after the house. So there was a lot of stigma she faced, but she says, now I can hold my head high, and I'm respected by the community because it's now more acceptable. So at that period of time, there was lots of cultural norms that are not now the norm, if that makes sense. We've moved on as a community. So in terms, I think that goes in terms of integration, and there was a lot of research at that time about the melting pot, but I think more research needs to be done on that now. And what I'm talking about is just some experiences from the community now. It's a lot more accepted, and we are sort of integrating. But whether the first generation feel that's what is worth it for them to come as a migrant and have a better life, that's a different aspect. So some are happier than others, depending on what their family situation has been or their story has been. So I think each individual participant had a story to tell, and that sort of gave the direction of this. And I think they would like to have that looking after their own, but it's not actually happening in a lot of areas.
Yes, thank you, and I see that there's others who want to come in. So
yeah. Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. When listening to you, actually, I was thinking of and talking about the mobility of Asian or women, whether Pakistani or from the rest of the Indian subcontinent. I thought about Gurinder Chadha's film Baji on the Beach in 1993.
Yes,
and
with the samosas at the beach.
yeah, I thought about it. It came to my mind because there's a group of, if I remember correctly, Punjabi women of various faiths going to Blackpool to see the Blackpool eliminations, and it was very interesting. And when I watched the film, actually, I realized that mobility or insularity could be a problem for women, who stayed very much locally and didn't have the opportunity of exploring other parts of the country. So that came to my mind. It was a brilliant film, actually. Now, you mentioned throughout your presentation the role, what you call second generation Pakistanis or third generation Pakistanis. My first question is, do these people still perceive themselves as Pakistanis, or would it be more appropriate to speak about British people of Pakistani heritage? Because what remains of the connection with Pakistan, with that sort of culture described in your talk, for people who were born in the UK, raised in the UK, suddenly adapted and adopted British norms in many ways? So that's my first question. And second question, what is their role, the role of the children, grandchildren, in enhancing the parents' or grandparents' mobility? Do they play a part in, getting their parents or grandparents somewhere else? So these are my questions.
Thank you very much, Vincent. And it's really great that you've referred to Baji on the beach. And I remember when I was talking to these participants who used to go on these trips to Bradford and Huddersfield. Yeah, that was the same concept. They used to prepare their samosas and their, the chapatis and their rotis the day before, and then really excited. It was all about that preparation and and the excitement of going to the trip, and same concept. So that was really well represented, if that makes sense. And the other thing is that it would, and I did refer to the second generation Pakistani migrants and the third generation, and there is a community aspect to it. And from the research that I've done, there is still that link, and the children do take on board the values of the parents, especially from their heritage. But there is also a lot of integration and that melting pot kind of terminology used, where born in British, proud to be British, and taken on board. So it's that that mixed identity. So it's in mobilities, the mobilities theory, which are really, there's so much of it that is so relevant. What John Ury talks about is that even your thought is a mobility, and our identities are a mobility, and we can have fluid identities. So with the participant group here, they've experienced these fluid identities as well, and that sort of trickles down to the second generation and then the third generation. So there is aspects of each culture within an individual from this particular background. And I haven't actually had done any research on this, but it'd be interesting to know how the second and third generation perceive themselves in terms of their identity, because it is universal. We all have mixed identities, I think, and fluid identities, depending on what setting one. It doesn't have to be about the heritage. There are other, what locality you're born in the country you're born in, or where you live in, you maybe take some aspects of that forward.
Okay. And then concerning the my second question about the role children might play in, you underline these mobility problems or issues, or the absence of mobility, or the difficulty actually to get mobile for that generation of migrants. So would you say children actually play a part, or grandchildren play a part in getting their parents to be less isolated than they would have been, otherwise?
Absolutely. I think that's a really big one, and I know that now we have parents. One example, which is really interesting one, was a participant who's now moved back to Pakistan. So there was always this, the diaspora always had this perception that they would move back home once, you know, the sort of retired. And majority of them have stayed, the participants I interviewed, but there was a few that had gone back to Pakistan to live, and they were just visiting on holiday. And what they were saying was that their children would take their grandchildren to Pakistan to visit them, and they were really proud to show them the village they were from, you know, how they sort of collected the water, etc. But there were other issues. So, for example, you know, the cost of the flights was really expensive over the summer holidays. So this particular family had took them out over the school term time, and their children got fines because their grandchildren didn't go to school on time. So there was so many other issues. So I think as much as there is efforts to that level, there is still a lot more to be to be looked at. And I think because of the busy lives and of everybody these days, the grandparents are perhaps need sort of spaces to go into, social spaces where the activities can be a bit more organized and coordinated rather than the ad hoc. Because I realize from the community here that the grandchildren, they like to go to soft play, they like to go to just shopping in general, so and you know, parks, but actually the facilities for the older people to take them are lacking, if that makes sense. So that there's a barrier there, so they can't actually walk to this soft play or the park. So the children are not available because they're at work. So there are efforts, but there's a lot more that needs to be thought about, because I think that is the loneliness and isolation that these participants have felt, and they're in the community. You know, a lot of effort has been made, but a lot of work still needs to be done.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Sonia, have you got your hand up?
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so thank you for this really engaging and touching discussion around aging and mobilities, and I was able to identify many parallels to my own ongoing research on transnational mobilities in French Pakistanis. So somehow Mr. Latu has asked some of my questions, but I have many more in mind. So what issues, first of all, I'd like to know about the community you worked in. Were these Pakistanis from Mirpur or from Punjab? And in terms of the sending areas or the place of origin, I'd like to know that what issues have you been able to identify in terms of mental and physical health, and have transnational mobilities or journeys back to Pakistan helped with improving their mental and social health in any meaningful ways?
Thank you very much, Sonia. So the first question was, were these participants from Mirpur or from Punjab? So they were from both. They're from both areas, and I didn't do this with the participants that this month for PhD student. I would like to still do this, is because there was a class difference, and I think Dr. Akhtar touched on that. There was some families, whether they were male or female, who were educated and some who weren't. So and I never actually did the analysis to say, you know, to look at the education and the areas they were from, because I've looked at other themes, but it's a really interesting way to look at it. And I think moving on, I would like to do that, because I think their trajectories in life have been slightly different, and their mental health and well-being may be different as well, but I can't say anything about that yet. Certainly the visits to Pakistan to visit their families has helped. You could see the glow on the faces of the participants when they talked about going back home, and you know, their families visiting and taking them gifts, and you know, just explaining how things had changed, or you know, how people had grown up, and you know, the shopping areas had changed. They were like, it was just, they couldn't stop talking about it because they're really sort of like, and I think what helped was making the phone calls to them, to their family members in Pakistan, as well as their friends, because I think that was important as well as the community in Pakistan. So it was almost like a glocal world, that like it was so close but so far. But that physical, that face-to-faceness of meeting them in their home country after being to living here in the UK really enhanced their lives, and they looked forward to the next visit and the next visit. Hence why there was participants who were feeling really sad that they knew that they couldn't travel back on the airplane because of their mobilities. And you know, so that was the other aspect of it. Sonia, was there anything else?
No, thank you. I'd just like to add something. I'd like to ask both of you a question, Dr. Akhtar and Dr. Sattar. What about the myth of return today? Where does it stand actually? What does your research say? Both of you, what would you like to say about that?
Shall I go first, Dr. Akhtar? I think it's froze, has it? I think maybe Dr. Akhtar has froze, but I will go first.
Very happy to go after you.
Okay, okay. So I feel like it's a lot broader than the myth of return now, because with the second generation, third generation migrants, our traveling has expanded, our arena has sort of widened. We have the stop off to Dubai before Pakistan. So families have started to travel to Dubai and then go to Pakistan. They've stayed off for a day, but now you'll find, because of the airlines and the way they're structuring their routes, you can actually stop off for a week in Dubai before you go to Pakistan. And you find the first generation Pakistani migrants now staying with their families in Dubai for a week and then going back to Pakistan, or on the way, on the return. Likewise, you can get a Turkish flight and then go to Pakistan. So we're finding that families are now traveling to Turkey and then staying there for a week or so, and then we're going to Pakistan either on the way there or on the way back. But we're actually traveling a lot more. Everyone's traveling a lot more, and that is no different for the second and third generation migrants from the community that I'm with, and my friends and family and colleagues. And naturally, with some of these families, the first generation migrants are traveling with them. So I feel as if that myth of return, there was a lot more dominant in the 70s and 80s to build your own house there because you're going to go back there, or etc., etc. But now it's like, you know, you stay in a hotel, you can travel around Pakistan, you don't need to build your house. So the perceptions and imaginaries have changed, I feel. So it'd be interesting to know what Dr. Akhtar has got to say. Over to you, Dr. Akhtar.
Yeah, sorry, I think I'm back. Thank you. Thanks, Zeb, and thanks for the question. Can you hear? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Sorry, I'd lost the group and now I'm back. Okay, and what I'd say is actually that's a really interesting question, because like Zeb has explained, I think there's been a real horizon expansion when it comes to mobilities. And what I've noticed amongst especially Sunni Pakistanis or Sunni Muslims more broadly, so outside of the ethnic group, Sunni Muslims in the UK are taking part in more religious tourism as well. So rather than going back to if they had become migrants or, you know, Sunni migrants to the UK, instead of going back to Pakistan, for example, or to Turkey or to Morocco, what they're doing is going on package holidays on to visit different shrines, to Uzbekistan, to Egypt. You know, so it's a really interesting that this religious tourism has really taken off. So it's really expanding people's horizons in that sense. So it's not just about going back home as a physical place that your parents were from, but going back home in terms of religious experiences. So going connecting to your spiritual home through this visiting of various different shrines. And I think that's becoming an important area of tourism for Muslim migrants in the UK.
Thank you so much. And I think Professor Galway has a question. So over to you.
Yeah, it's on mute, Professor.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. Can you all hear me now?
Yeah, we can.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Sattar and Dr. Akhtar, and thank you, everybody, for the. I really like the presentation, the discussion, and the questions and the reactions to the questions, because it's been very stimulating. Lots of insights on migration and aging, and I think you've all sort of collectively covered quite a lot of ground, but I'm curious about another aspect that I thought was very interesting in the initial presentation, which was one of the interviewees who said, "I like it here in Newcastle." I think, if I'm not misrepresenting your presentation, Dr. Sattar, one of the male subjects, one of the male participants, saying, "I like it here in Newcastle," and I thought, oh, that's interesting. So, to what extent is aging, the experience of aging as a migrant related to one specific locality, as opposed to just thinking about aging as a Pakistani in Britain, but in Newcastle particularly? What is the importance, the depth of the attachment to the locality?
So that's a, sorry. Yeah, that's fascinating. You picked up on that, Professor. Absolutely fascinating, because there's some current research from Northumbria University that has took place, and it's basically the message there is that older people like to age in place, and these people have been in Newcastle for decades, and they now see that as their home, and they would like to age in Newcastle. And it's not even about moving out of the Newcastle. They like to stay in their ward, if that makes sense. They don't even want to move out of their ward, because they know where the shops are. They know, the people, they're familiar with that. So they want to be around familiar buildings, places, spaces, and age there. So that was really a significant finding, and that is a universal finding, and that is relevant equally to this particular group as well.
Yeah, thanks. I just had one more little question about those male participants, because I can't remember if it was the same person or the other one who said, we used to go to the cinema a lot, when he was talking about the wages. Yes, he got at the beginning. And I was wondering, okay, what kind of films would Pakistani young men, migrant men, what kind of films would they go and watch? Was it the films that everybody else in Britain would go and watch, or did they have specific tastes and interests at the time? Or
Well, that again, really good question, because in those days, in the 60s and 70s, there was one cinema that sort of streamed the Indian movies, and these the Asian men Pakistani men would go to, and actually I'm saying South Asian, I think it's South Asian, I'm going to correct myself, because it was the Indian as well, and the Pakistani, they would go to this particular cinema in Newcastle on a Sunday afternoon, and that was their highlight of the week after a hard week of work, and they would watch an Indian movie. So, and then again, it's not transgressing, I suppose, but those Indian movies, as the wives came over of these participants, they then started to watch the movies at home. So they would hire a video recorder on a weekend, and they would watch 2 or 3 of these Indian movies. And with having said that, really interestingly, I am aware that the Indian movies are not doing as well at cinemas, and that's because of the digital technologies advancement, because the second and third generation are watching movies, across the globe, and Indian movies is something that the first generation are really connected, maybe the second generation to an extent, but there's been a few movies, and I will mention this actor's name, Amitabh Bachchan. I don't know if those of us who are familiar with the South Asian actors in India, and a few of those actors have released some movies, and they thought they would do really well because they hadn't released since the lockdown, etc. But they haven't done as well, and maybe they've done okay, but not as well as they expected. But I feel as if it's probably been the first generation and perhaps some of the second generation who've watched them, because that is what they were used to from those days. But now, because there's other, Netflix, etc., it's wider, so it's not as dominant. So they're not as culturally. So that was another part of the culture. So again, the loss of that culture through not watching the Indian movies. Is that okay? I don't know if you want to add to that, Dr. Akhtar.
Can I just add one thing, pick up on a point that Professor Leto brought up, actually, and it was about the South Asian self-identity, identification. And I just want to say a small anecdote about the strength of that South Asian identity, actually. Our new Prime Minister in the UK, Rishi Sunak, his grandparents, his paternal grandparents, were from Gujranwala in present-day Pakistan, and they moved in the 1930s to East Africa, to Kenya, and his parents, both Rishi Sunak's parents, were born and brought up in East Africa, and they only came to the UK in the 1960s. And yet today, when Rishi Sunak is asked, about his identity, how he sees himself, he says, well, I tick British Indian on the census. So I think that gives us a little sense of how strong that British South Asian self-identification is, really. So amongst all social strata, so from somebody who went to the most prestigious private educational institution and they've followed the British elite trajectory, to right to the kind of people that Dr. Sattar has been interviewing.
Thank you. Well, thank you. That was very interesting remark.
If I may, I had a last question. I was wondering about, you talked obviously about the mobility of aging migrants, and I was talking about the final mobility of migrants after their deaths. And I was wondering whether the people you have interviewed, people you've actually investigated, tend to be buried in Britain or in Pakistan after the deaths.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So my father died in 1991, and he was buried in Pakistan. It took us about 5 days to get the body over, and I was still in my last year of my degree. I was still undergraduate, so it was quite traumatic, if I could say the least. But having said that, now there's a tendency to bury in the country that the person has passed away in. So, but that doesn't mean to say there aren't any anomalies. There are still some families who prefer to take their older relative to the home country, such as Pakistan, because all of the others, their husband or wife and other siblings are buried in that same graveyard, so they want to take them there. But that is, or it might be a dying wish of that particular person. But apart from that, it's more and more common now, practiced for the person to be buried here in the UK. Yeah, and I think if I was, so my mum is, thankfully we've still got my mum. She would, we would bury her here, and she has not said or have got any last wishes. Likewise with ourselves, we wouldn't identify as a British Pakistani. I would like to be buried where I die, and if that's here in the UK, Newcastle, that's fine.
Thank you. Sorry, it was a heavy question. I'm sorry.
No, absolutely fine. It's fine. And I think this is why I'm so passionate about this, because there's so much more to it. There's just so much more identities and place and movement.
David has a question, so over to you.
Yes, Thank you, Sonia, and thank you, Dr. Sattar, for your presentation. Bearing in mind what we said about the diasporic identity of Pakistani migrants to the UK, do you still feel that there is like a specificity of the local context? Is the experience of these people in Newcastle somewhat different to what it is in London? I understand that you studied only Newcastle, but maybe if you have a few thoughts about that, is that something that came up, let's say, in your data, that people would mention the local environment in form of a specific way, or would you rather say that your data is representative of the Pakistani British experience in general?
Yeah, thank you, David. I would say it's definitely representative across the UK. So, for example, there is this requirement to be face-to-face in terms of weddings and funerals as part of the mobilities theory, and that's equally high in the Pakistani community. So if there is a funeral, for example, back in the 60s and 70s, and probably 80s and 90s as well, there would be a car that maybe have 3 or 4 members of a household that would get into a car and travel to Bradford or London or Nottingham to attend that funeral on the day. Likewise, people would come from other places to Newcastle. As things have moved on, families have their own cars and they don't need to share the cars as much. But there is still this expectation to be face-to-face in, for example, weddings as well, and they would travel across the country. So it is universal across the country for this particular participant group. I think it was really interesting over COVID. It didn't, obviously, nobody was allowed to meet each other in this face-to-faceness, and in a way it is in the community. So if there's a lot of people at your wedding or your funeral, the value, your respect and your value, please correct me, Sonia or Dr. Akhtar, in the community, that it's well thought of. But during COVID, you couldn't do that. So, there was limited numbers, or people didn't go, they were worried. And it worked really well. And now, coming out of COVID, families are preferring to have smaller weddings. And even with funerals, maybe a telephone call is sufficient. So that expectation isn't there because of it. And there is, the reduced need to be face-to-face. So there's an interesting development going on right now.
Thank you.
Thanks, that's great. Have we lost Dr. Akhtar?
No, I'm still here.
Oh, there, hi. I don't know if you would agree with that. Would you say there's some changes right now?
I think so. I think so, and I think it's interesting, this question about the local and the national. Mm-hmm. I think there's very specific local identities. There's a very specific Northeast identity. There's a very specific Bradfordian identity, and I think it's reflective of the broader kind of North-South division in the UK. I think that the South Asians or the migrants in London, for example, have a very specific kind of identity. And actually, if you talk to participants themselves, they'll say, oh, well, we know that up north, we're 10, 20 years behind what's happening in London. So there's this kind of sense of difference, geographical difference, even within the UK. But no, I think, you're right in the sense that this face-to-face, this mobility of, packing yourself into a car, going to a wedding, across, across the UK, just going to that wedding, not going sightseeing, packing back into the car, coming back again. That's very much a part of, a very specific British Pakistani experience, and that's the working class experience.
Yes, absolutely. So can I just add into there that talking about geographies? So what I'm really looking to work towards now is how do we reduce social isolation and loneliness in this community in the Northeast? But we're looking at the Bradfordian experience and the southern experience, because the health and social care services are more advanced compared to the Northeast. For example, there are care homes that cater for the South Asian community in these other geographies compared to the Northeast. So we don't have a care home specific, we don't have daycare service specifics, they are sort of fragmented, and so we have older people. So as a registered manager working in care homes, we've had odd people, so the one or two people who've worked lived in a care home from a South Asian community, but you know, there's a lot of cultural differences, and the cultural appropriateness needs needs a lot more work. So I'm looking into that and looking at trying to see what the models are across the country to see if we can work on something here in the Northeast for these aging migrants.
Yeah, no, very interesting. I mean, we have in the Midlands, where I'm based at the moment, you have older people's homes called Apna Ghar, which is basically our home, or Hamara village, or so you do have those kind of very specific homes. Having said that, I would say, Dr. Sattar, that funding for social care is being cut across the across the UK, and it's cut to the bone. So if there's any money flitting around anyway, I'm not sure it's going to be for culturally specific kind of, just because the need is so great across the UK. And in this moment in time, I think it's pretty dire, the situation, when it comes to not just the NHS, but actually social care and aging, as I'm sure you know better than I.
Absolutely, yeah. We're still working on it, but all I can say is that it's a drop in the ocean, but it's better to, I think we need the evidence base, because we're still at that evidence based situation, and hopefully things will get better.
Of course.
Thank you.
Yes, I have one final question before we say goodbye. So I'd like to ask you about your book. Is this book about Pakistani first generation migrants in Newcastle-upon-Tyne, or is it more broadly about Pakistani migrants in the UK?
Actually, Sonia, this is the book on my PhD, so it has the different themes of the of the findings of the PhD, but I am also writing a book for the layman's, because when I interviewed these participants, they went into a lot of detail about their life histories, and they wanted to read it, but more so I feel as if their families want to read it as well, because some of these these participants have passed away. So as something that I feel like I need to give back to this community, writing this book in layman's terms, so that they can understand what it was like for their family members to come into the UK, not knowing the language and not knowing, where they were going to live, and how they settled and where they are now. So hopefully that will be next year if we can get that ready. So it's for the community, but I think it would probably appeal to a lot of people across the UK, because they have had similar experiences.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sonia.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. It was excellent, and thank you so much, Sonia, for inviting me and some great discussion. So thank you from here.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. It's been really good to talk about a PhD. It's not often you get a chance to talk about that.
Well, thanks to both of you. We really appreciated your participating in the talk and the chance we got to ask questions.
And we'll keep in touch.
It was great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very
great.
much.
Okay.
And we're happy that you agree that we can post this recording on our website, because that's usually
absolutely
really
fine.
helpful, and that gets us a lot more clicks and viewers, and so it's really helpful to spread the research around. So it
is, absolutely, I totally agree.
Great. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Uh,